padre ha muerto! ¡Mi marido me engaña! ¡Loca!
A queen sat locked inside a stone tower for 46 years, not because she was mad, but because powerful men needed the world to believe she was. Her name was Juana of Castile. Her sister didn't escape it either, Katherine of Aragon, exiled in an abandoned castle by the king who rewrote the laws of God just to get rid of her. 2 sisters, daughters of the most powerful queen in Europe, Isabella of Castile, both born to rule, both destroyed by the men they married. One husband stole a crown, the other stole a marriage. But here's the question that will haunt you. Was Juana the Mad truly insane, or was she a perfectly sane queen trapped in the greatest political lie of the 16th century? Because the greatest betrayal of their lives didn't happen on a battlefield, it happened inside their own marriages. And once you hear what really happened to them, you'll wonder how history ever let these men off the hook.
Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past.
If these untold stories speak to you, hit the like button and join our family. Let's step into the past together. Chapter 1. The girls born to rule a world that would not let them. Toledo, Spain, November 6th, 1479. Queen Isabella I of Castile gives birth to her 3rd child, a girl they name Juana. She is not the heir. That is her older brother Juan. She is not even second in line. That is her older sister Isabella. By the strict logic of royal succession, Juana is a spare, a piece on the board to be married off at the right moment to the right foreign court. But her parents are not ordinary monarchs. King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella had united the crowns of Castile and Aragon through their own marriage in 1469, stitching together a country that had been fragmented for centuries. By 1492, they had completed the Reconquista, expelled Muslims and Jews from Spain, funded Christopher Columbus, and built the Spanish Inquisition into one of the most feared instruments of religious control in European history. These are the people who raised Juana. And so Juana grows up in a palace that smells of incense and authority. She is educated like a prince, canon law, philosophy, languages, mathematics, and music. Her tutors quietly note she is the sharpest of Isabella's children, curious, precise, deeply interior. But it is that interiority, that quiet, watchful depth that begins to worry people around her. In a court where faith is not personal but political, where doubt is not tolerated but prosecuted, Juana's silence reads as suspicion. There are whispers that she questions the church, that she is not devout enough, that something is wrong with her. According to letters from Ferdinand's own bedchamber attendant, Juana was subjected as a child to a method called la cuerda, suspended from a rope with weights tied to her feet to root out suspected heresy. Her own mother, who once declared she would rather see Spain depopulated than corrupted by unbelief, signed off on this. Juana was a child when it happened. Think about what that does to a person. Not the pain itself, but the message underneath it. You are not safe, even here, even from your own mother, even in your own home. That is not the beginning of madness. That is the beginning of survival. Now, 7 years later, her parents have a plan, a grand, precise European plan, and Juana is part of it whether she wants to be or not. They are sending her across the sea to marry a man she has never met, a man they call the Handsome. And what happens the moment she sees him will change everything, not just for Juana, but for the entire future of Spain.
Chapter 2. The Man She Should Never Have Loved. August 1496. Juana is 16 years old.
standing at a Spanish harbor, watching 22,000 people board ships on her behalf. Soldiers, ladies-in-waiting, priests, servants, an entire floating court sailing to the Low Countries so that she can marry Philip, Duke of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. She has never met him. She does not know if he is kind. She does not know what he sounds like when he laughs, or whether he laughs at all. She only knows what her parents have told her, that this marriage is necessary, strategic, and final. The crossing takes a month. Storms tear through the fleet. 3 ships sink. Juana arrives ill, exhausted, and seasick. And Philip, her future husband, does not come to meet her. His sister Margaret greets her instead, which tells you almost everything you need to know about Philip of Burgundy. But then they meet, and whatever Juana expected, whatever careful, dutiful emotion she had prepared, it evaporates the moment she sees him. Philip was called the Handsome, and the name earned itself. He was magnetic, radiant, the kind of man a room reorganizes itself around. And the attraction was mutual, so immediate and so overwhelming that Philip summoned a priest that same night and demanded the marriage be performed before morning so it could be consummated at once. The poor cleric had barely finished the blessing before the couple vanished. A formal church ceremony followed the next day, but the message was already written in stone. This union was built not on diplomacy, but on desire. And desire, as anyone in the 16th century could have told you, is the most unstable foundation there is. The early years were genuinely alive. 6 children born between 1498 and 1507. Juana adapted, imperfectly, painfully, to a Burgundian court that had no patience for Spanish customs and even less for Spanish advisors. But she tried. Philip did not try at all. He drank, he feasted, he took mistresses openly, not discreetly, not with the usual courtly pretense of respect, but openly, in front of everyone. And the Burgundian court considered this entirely normal. Aristocratic wives were expected to lower their eyes and manage their households. Grief was private, dignity was performance. Juana had not been raised for performance. She had been raised by Isabella of Castile, a woman who bent entire nations to her will. And so when Philip's infidelity became undeniable, Juana did not lower her eyes. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Juana confronted him. She demanded answers. But Philip ignored her. Anger began to consume her. Some nights she shouted at him openly. Other nights she wandered the palace halls, unable to sleep, pacing the cold corridors until dawn. Then came the incident that the court used against her. According to court records, Juana discovered one of Philip's mistresses, a woman he was deeply infatuated with. In a sudden burst of fury, Juana rushed at the woman, grabbed her hair, and cut it off with her bare hands. After that night, the whispers around the court only grew louder. The court was horrified, not at Philip, at Juana. Philip's response was not remorse, it was strategy. He began punishing her after every argument by locking her out of his chambers, sometimes for days. And while she wandered and wept, he ordered her own treasurer to keep a secret diary of every incident, every outburst, every tear, and send it directly to her parents in Spain. Her own household was a surveillance operation. Her private suffering was being turned into a document, and that document was building a case. Philip's diary reports did not frame Juana's grief as grief, they framed it as instability. Every sleepless night became evidence of mental deterioration. Every confrontation became proof of irrationality. This was not psychiatry, it was paperwork designed to serve a political purpose, and it worked exactly as intended. And then, before Philip could finish building the trap, death started moving through Juana's family, and it moved fast. Chapter 3. When the throne finds you, whether you want it or not. October 1497. Juana's brother, Juan, Crown Prince of Spain, the heir to everything, dies suddenly at 19. His young widow, Margaret, is pregnant. 2 months later, the baby is stillborn. In one winter, the entire male Trastamara line is gone. Juana's older sister, Isabella, now Queen of Portugal through her marriage, died the following year while giving birth to a son. The baby, Miguel, survives. For one brief, fragile moment, this infant holds the potential to unite the crowns of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal under a single ruler. 3 kingdoms on one small life. July 19, 1500. Miguel is buried before his 2nd birthday. In less than 3 years, Juana has watched her only brother, his unborn child, her eldest sister, and her nephew all disappear. She is 20 years old. She is grieving without pause, without relief, without anyone around her, not her husband, not her mother, not the indifferent Burgundian court, who treats that grief as anything other than a problem to be managed. And now, by pure elimination, she is heir to the most powerful throne in Europe. Nobody planned for this. Isabella and Ferdinand's entire European strategy had been built around Juan inheriting Spain and their daughters serving as diplomatic anchors in foreign courts. Juana was never supposed to rule. The idea troubled her mother. It alarmed her father, and it transformed her husband, who suddenly found himself one heartbeat away from becoming the most powerful man on the continent, from an indifferent spouse into a very interested one. In 1502, Juana is formally named Princess of Asturias and travels with Philip to Spain for the swearing-in ceremony before the Cortes. That same year, the marriage reaches its first true collapse. After a catastrophic argument, Philip rides away to Flanders without her. Juana begs her mother to let her follow. Isabella refuses and has her locked inside Castle La Mota at Medina del Campo. What follows is the scene history loves to hold up as proof of her madness. Juana stands in the freezing courtyard for hours through the night, refusing food and sleep, screaming to be released. She wanders, she mutters. The guards file reports. But stop for a moment. A woman has just been locked in a castle against her will, separated from her children, abandoned by her husband, and surrounded by a court that has already decided she is unstable. What exactly were her options? Silence? Compliance? Would we call that sanity or surrender? Her mother, Isabella, is dying, and as she prepares to leave the world, she will make one last attempt to protect her daughter. It will fail, because the man she trusted to carry it out is the same man who will use it to destroy her.
Chapter 4. 2 Men and the Crown They Both Wanted. November 1504. Isabella I of Castile dies. Her will is careful, deliberate, and, she believes, protective. Juana inherits Castile as Queen Regnant. If Juana is unable or unwilling to govern, Ferdinand serves as regent, but only temporarily, only until Juana's heir comes of age. It reads like a safety net. It functions like a starting pistol. Ferdinand and Philip go to war immediately. Not with armies, with documents, rumors, and coin. Both men mint currency bearing Juana's face. Both men invoke her name in every proclamation. Both men stand before their respective courts and declare themselves her faithful protectors. Neither man asks her opinion about anything. Ferdinand makes the first move that should stop us cold. He stands before the Cortes, Spain's parliament, and has officials read aloud the private surveillance reports Philip has been compiling for years. Every emotional outburst, every sleepless night, every incident of grief. Her own father puts her own private suffering on public display. Not to help her, not out of concern, to destroy her credibility in front of the men whose consent he needs to govern Castile. This is not a worried parent. This is a politician removing a rival who happens to share his blood. In September 1505, Juana gives birth to her daughter, Mary, under considerable strain, with the succession dispute raging around her. Philip continues pressing for their return to Flanders and the Burgundian territories he controls.
In early 1506, Juana and Philip set sail for Castile to confront Ferdinand directly. The crossing is violent. A severe storm strikes their fleet in the English Channel and forces the ships into port in England, where they are received at the court of Henry VII. There, in a remarkable and undocumented meeting, Juana comes face to face with her younger sister Katherine, now the widowed Dowager Princess of Wales, living in reduced circumstances after the death of her first husband, Arthur. It is the only time Juana will see any of her siblings between her departure from Spain in 1496 and her death in 1555. After the storm passes, they complete the crossing and arrive in Castile in June 1506. Ferdinand and Philip meet privately and sign a formal agreement, the Concordia de Villafafila, in which both men agree to exclude Juana from her own government on the grounds of her alleged incapacity. Juana, the actual Queen of Castile, is not present at the meeting, is not consulted before it, and is not informed of its contents until after the fact. When she finds out, her fury is immediate and unambiguous. That fury is then recorded and filed as more evidence. Do you see the architecture of it? Every time she behaves like a queen defending her legal rights, it is filed as evidence of instability. The more clearly she sees what is happening, the more her clarity is used against her. It is a mechanism as old as power itself. Discredit the person, not the argument. And in 16th century Europe, where a woman's mental state can be judged and recorded by the men who govern around her, that tactic can be devastatingly effective. By 1506, the plan to have Juana declared incompetent is essentially complete. Ferdinand has the witnesses, Philip has the documents. All they need is for time to continue doing what it has always done. Then September 1506 arrives, and Philip, young, handsome, untouchable Philip, falls ill. Within 6 days, everything changes. Chapter 5. The grief they used to bury her. She does not leave his side. Juana, heavily pregnant, exhausted, the weight of an entire kingdom already pressing on her, sits beside Philip's bed as the fever climbs. For 6 days she stays. She does not sleep. She barely eats. She watches the most consuming presence in her life drain away hour by hour. September 25th, 1506. Philip the Handsome dies at 28 years old. What happens next is cited for 5 centuries as the definitive evidence of Juana's insanity. She refuses to leave his body. She will not allow the coffin to be sealed. Court observers write that she touches his face, kisses his hands and feet. When the procession finally begins the long journey south toward Granada, where Philip will be buried beside the Catholic monarchs, she insists on traveling at night. Only at night. No women should see him, even now. When they stop to rest during the day, she refuses to allow the cortege to stop at convents, ordering rest at monasteries instead. Some accounts, written years later, describe her opening the coffin during stops on the journey. Whether those specific accounts are accurate or embellished after the fact, the core record is clear. Her grief is visible, prolonged, and public. What is less often said is this: prolonged mourning rituals are well documented in both Spanish and Burgundian royal courts of this era. Royal widows wear black for years. Elaborate vigils and the refusal to seal coffins immediately are recorded practices. What distinguishes Juana's grief is its duration and intensity, which reflects a relationship of 10 years, 6 children, sustained infidelity and emotional cruelty. It is not a simple marriage to grieve. 10 years of betrayal and love she cannot turn off, no matter how much reason tells her to. In January 1507, Juana goes into labor. She refuses midwives and delivers alone. The child is a girl, Catalina, her sixth and last child, the final piece of a marriage that has defined and damaged her entire adult life. Ferdinand moves immediately. He dismisses Juana's loyal household staff one by one, replacing him with his own appointments. He forces Juana to formally surrender her royal powers at Hornillos. Then, in February 1509, he confines her, along with her young children Ferdinand and Catalina, to the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, a walled complex on the Duero River in central Spain. He also takes her eldest son, Charles, while her other daughters, Eleanor, Isabella, and Mary, grow up apart from her, far from Tordesillas. By 1510, Ferdinand named himself administrator of Castile. The rumors of the queen's madness continued to spread, carefully sustained by the people now controlling her world. Juana is 30 years old, and the door closes behind her. For years she receives no news from outside, no letters, no visitors that Ferdinand has not approved. Her world becomes the walls of Tordesillas and the quiet company of her children, her son Ferdinand, her daughter Isabella, Eleanor and her youngest daughter Catalina, the child born alone in January 1507, Philip's last gift, and they are now the only warmth left in her life.
Then in 1516, Ferdinand dies. For a moment, just a moment, there is reason to hope. Her son Charles is now free, her own blood, the child she gave birth to in Burgundy in 1500, who carries her crown and her name into the world. Surely a son will do what a father and a husband never did. Surely a son will open the door. Juana waits. She is loyal to that hope the way she was loyal to everything, completely and at great cost to herself. Charles does not come immediately, not for years. When he finally arrives, he is not alone. His sister Eleanor accompanies him. And somewhere in that long waiting, the story begins to shift. Not in Juana herself, but in the way the world watches her. What happens next will make historians pause for centuries. But for now, the door remains shut. Juana is waiting, patient, desperate, and hoping for a son who might one day come to save her. But before we see if her son will act, let's turn to her younger sister, another royal woman, fighting for the love of her husband, just as Juana did. Chapter 6. The sister who held the line until there was nothing left. While Juana disappears behind the walls of Tordesillas, her younger sister Katherine faces her own trial, a different ocean, a different court, the same inheritance of disposability. Katherine of Aragon arrives in England in 1501 at 16 to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales. By April, Arthur dies of sweating sickness at 15. Katherine is a widow in a foreign land, with no income, no clear future, and a father, Ferdinand, who has little reason to fight for her now that her political value has expired. She waits 7 years, living in genuine poverty, moving between residences. Her letters requesting funds from Spain go mostly unanswered. She pawns her jewelry to maintain her household. When she meets Juana briefly during the English Channel storm of 1506, Katherine is already a royal woman stripped of power, surviving by wits and endurance. Then Henry VIII takes the throne in 1509. He is 18 years old, and he chooses Katherine, not because he's forced to, but because he wants her. She is composed, educated, and carries herself with an authority that his court finds magnetic. He calls her his perfect queen. For a while, he means it. Katherine is not a decorative wife. In 1513, while Henry campaigns in France, she governs England as regent. When Scotland invades, it is Katherine who coordinates the military response. The English win at Flodden Field while Henry is abroad and Katherine is in charge. But the pregnancies do not hold. Miscarriages, a stillbirth, a son who lives 52 days. Only one child survives, Mary, born in 1516, a daughter. And for Henry, a daughter is not enough.
By the late 20s, Henry is pursuing an annulment. His argument? Katherine was married to his brother Arthur first, and church law forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow. The marriage, he says, never existed. Katherine's answer is immediate and immovable. Her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. The Pope had granted a dispensation. The marriage is valid. She is his wife. She is the Queen of England, and she will not say otherwise. She writes to Rome. She argues canon law. She refuses to appear before the domestic tribunal Henry assembles, correctly seeing it as neither legitimate nor impartial. Think about what connects these two sisters. Juana fights back with rage, confronting Philip, weeping through the night, refusing to be invisible. Katherine fights back with law, documents, appeals, formal refusals. Two completely different women, two completely different methods, the same ending.
Henry breaks from the Catholic Church entirely, declares himself its head, and has the marriage annulled by his own archbishop in 1533. Katherine is stripped of her title, separated from her daughter Mary, and moved to cold, damp, remote properties, Buckton, then Kimbolton. The offer comes repeatedly: sign the document, accept the annulment, and life becomes easier. She never signs, not once. January 7th, 1536. Katherine dies at Kimbolton Castle. She is 50 years old. Her final letter is addressed to Henry. She calls him her most dear lord and husband. She forgives him. She says her eyes desire him above all things. She signs it, Katherine, Queen of England. Even at the end. Two sisters, one imprisoned by a diagnosis, one erased by a document. Both of them loved men who used that love against them. And neither of them, not once, not at the very end, stopped being exactly who they were.
Chapter 7. The Queen Who Dies Alone. Her son, Charles V, finally visits Tordesillas. It is around 1517, roughly 16 or 17 years after Juana last saw him as a small child in Burgundy. She is in her late 30s. He is 17 and already the most powerful ruler in the Western world. Her daughter, Eleanor, is with him, a quiet shadow beside her brother. But the visit is not what Juana has hoped for. Charles comes not to free her, not to rescue his mother, but as part of the formal recognition of his authority in Castile. He technically inherits the crown as King of Castile and Aragon, but Juana is still legally queen. He comes to obtain her consent to rule and to assert his position. Her eldest son arrives not to embrace her mother, but to take the crown she has borne through suffering. Charles never visits her again. There is no reason for it. After he leaves, the guards at Tordesillas are doubled. No further visits are recorded for years. The hope she has carried for over a decade, that a son might do what a father and husband never did, quietly dies in that room, unspoken and unseen. In 1518, her son Ferdinand is taken from her without warning. Her youngest daughter, Catalina, becomes the only family left by her side. One by one, her other daughters are married off across Europe. Isabella to Christian II of Denmark in 1515, Eleanor to Manuel I of Portugal in 1518, and Mary to Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia in 1521. Each departure is arranged without Juana. Each departure shrinks her world a little more. Then, in 1525, Charles arranges Catalina's marriage to King João III of Portugal. She is taken from Tordesillas at midnight. Juana is not consulted. She is barely informed. She never sees Catalina again. What follows is 30 long years of silence. When Ferdinand dies and an envoy reviews Juana's living conditions at Tordesillas, the envoy suspends Mosen Ferrer, a longtime servant of Ferdinand who has been watching over Juana.
Ferrer protests his suspension. In his defense, he states that he had only ordered la cuerda, the same rope torture used on Juana as a child, to be applied when she refuses to eat, claiming it is done to preserve her life. This is the treatment of a queen, documented by the people responsible for her care. Charles appoints the Marquis de Denia as Juana's guardian at Tordesillas. The Marquis reports directly to Charles and controls every detail of Juana's daily existence. Denia lies to her consistently. He refuses to tell her news of her children. For years after Ferdinand's death, he tells Juana that her father is still alive. Charles's own instructions to Denia are historically recorded. He orders that no person speak with Her Majesty, for no good could come from it. At this point, it seems like you know the real story. Juana the Mad, the name everyone believes. But what if I told you there's evidence that changes everything you thought you knew? In 1520, the Comunero rebels storm Tordesillas and free her. They bring proclamations and ask her to sign. She reads them carefully, refuses to sign anything that can harm the kingdom, and asks them specifically to stop destroying church property. When the rebellion collapses and Charles retakes control, she is returned to Tordesillas. Even then, she is not released, but the security around her is increased. Her father locked her away. Her husband built the case that justified it. Her son inherits the arrangement and maintains it for the rest of her life. She is loyal to all three of them, as the record shows. She never publicly denounces Ferdinand, never speaks against Philip's memory, never does anything that could damage the crown her son wears. That loyalty is returned with a door that stays locked. Her health declines in the final years. Accounts from Denia's staff describe a woman who refuses to eat for long periods, who spends hours on the floor, and who resists being moved. No independent physician is brought in. No reassessment of her condition is ordered. The reports are written by Charles's appointed guardian and sent to Charles. They say what they say. On April 12, 1555, Good Friday, Juana of Castile dies inside the palace of Tordesillas. She is 75 years old. She has outlived all of her siblings. She has outlived one of her own children. She dies alone, attended by caretakers appointed by a son she authorized to rule beside her, who never once chooses to free her. She has been Queen of Castile for 51 years. For 48 of them, she governs nothing. She is buried in Granada's La Capilla Real, beside Philip, the man whose surveillance diary helped build the case against her, and across the aisle from Isabella and Ferdinand, the parents who began it. Charles abdicates his empire later that same year and retires to a monastery in Extremadura, where he lives until 1558. He is remembered as one of the great rulers of European history. Juana is remembered as the Mad. Chapter 8. The verdict history took 5 centuries to deliver. Let us go back to 1509, 2 years into Juana's imprisonment at Tordesillas. A Flemish ambassador, a man with no stake in either side of the Spanish succession, is granted a visit. He goes expecting, perhaps, the raving, hysterical woman he has been told about. He writes in his formal diplomatic report that she spoke with great intelligence and clarity and appeared to be fully in possession of her faculties. He expresses, between the lines of his careful diplomatic language, discomfort because he has seen nothing that justifies what is being done to her. His report is filed, and it changes nothing. When the Comuneros rebellion asked her to sign documents legitimizing their rebellion, she refuses, carefully, deliberately. There is no chaos, confusion, incoherence. This is not the response of a woman who has lost her mind. This is the response of a queen who understands exactly what is being asked of her and declines. These 2 moments sit in the historical record like questions nobody in power wanted answered. A woman demonstrating full political coherence in 1509. A woman exercising precise legal and moral judgment in 1520. And then, nothing.
no reassessment, no independent review. No physician was brought in to ask whether the grounds for her confinement still held. Modern historians have examined the question of her mental health seriously. The scholar Pfondel argued for schizophrenia. Alvarez argues she suffered from depression. Some have pointed to her maternal grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, who similarly isolated herself and was confined to a convent, and who most historians now believe suffered from postpartum depression rather than permanent incapacity. The pattern across generations is noted, though not conclusive. What historian Bergenroth argues, and the documentary record supports, is that Juana's condition was grossly exaggerated by those around her. The de Vere letter, long cited as primary evidence of her madness, was written to Philibert de Vere, Philip the Handsome's ambassador in Spain. This letter was presented by her husband and father to convince everyone that she was unfit to rule. Scholars, including V.S., now read it differently. An expression of intense marital love weaponized as a medical diagnosis. What the record does confirm is this. Whatever Juana's mental state was when she arrived at Tordesillas in 1507, her treatment there was designed to worsen it, not address it. The Marquis of Denia, her own guardian appointed by her own son, wrote to Charles that torture would in many respects be a service and a good thing rendered to God and to her highness. Mosen Ferrer confirmed that the rope torture had been applied to her when she refused to eat.
Whether or not Juana arrived at Tordesillas mentally ill, the treatment she received there would destabilize any person. And the 1509 and 1520 records raise a question nobody with power ever chose to ask. What if, by that point, she had stabilized? What if the woman who refused to sign rebel documents in 1520 was no longer the grief-shattered widow of 1507? What if the confinement had, by then, lost even the thin justification it began with? Nobody checked. Nobody was asked to check. Katherine's story ends the same way. Different method, same destination. One sister erased with a diagnosis, one erased with a document, both separated from their children. Both died in isolation under the authority of men who called it necessary.
Their mother, Isabella I, ruled Spain, founded an empire, and is celebrated to this day. Her daughters, who inherited her refusal to submit, are remembered as a madwoman and a discarded wife. The facts have always been in the record. What changes 5 centuries later is simply whether anyone chooses to read them. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to hear what you think in the comments. Juana authorized Charles to rule alongside her. She gave him that willingly, and he left her in that room for the rest of her life. So do you think Charles genuinely believed his mother was too ill to rule, or did he know exactly what he was doing and choose the empire over the woman who gave it to him? There is no comfortable answer. Leave yours below. I read every single comment. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Juana or Katherine differently by the end, please subscribe, hit the bell, share this with one person who loves history. Every view is a small act of giving these women back the audience they were always owed. And if you want another story that history almost buried for good, the next video is right here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.